Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah walhamdulillah wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. So inshallah ta'ala now we're going to move on to Hafsa bint Umar radiyallahu anhuma. May Allah be pleased with them both. And I don't know how much we're going to get done today. We're going to try to get done Hafsa and Zainab bint Khuzaimah tonight inshallah. So bear with me. We might have to stay a little bit extra tonight inshallah ta'ala. Hafsa radiallahu ta'ala anha, what is the Arabic meaning of Hafsa? What is it? Live? Lions? Very smart, very close. Now Hafsa, I'll explain it though. Hafsa refers to a bird that the Arabs know, which is called al-rakhma. Rakhma is a very elegant, beautiful bird. But Hafsa refers to a bird that's beautiful, but at the same time it can be a predator too. So the reason why the name arises is that it's a person who is beautiful and elegant, but still powerful. Okay? So still has a strong personality, which subhanAllah ends up, Hafsa radiallahu anha has a very strong personality as well. Now I'll talk about the name though, inshallah ta'ala, which was also brought up. Or actually, let me just mention it now. Hafs, in the Arabic language, Hafs refers to a lion. But Hafs refers to what type of lion? Hafs refers to a shibl, okay? Which is like the cub. You guys know the very famous saying in the Arabic language? that tilka shibl min dhak al-asad, right? The shibl comes from the asad. Like when a person is praising himself, he says he's a lion. I gave birth to that little cub. I gave birth to that young lion, okay? The Prophet ﷺ called Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu Abu Hafs. But he called him Abu Hafs in the Battle of Badr, where Hafsa radiallahu anha still was not in the picture. So it's unclear whether the Prophet ﷺ meant Abu Hafs as in Hafsa, okay? Because like he shortened Aisha to Aish, maybe he shortened Hafsa to Hafs. It's not clear whether he meant that or whether he was referring to a shibli, or whether he was referring to the young lion, because it's in a wartime that Abu Hafs is literally the kunya of the Asad. It's a kunya of a lion, okay? It's what you call the lion, the father of the cub, all right? So it's not clear whether he was doing that to refer to Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu in that way, or whether he was referring to Hafsa radiallahu ta'ala anha. But anyway, Hafsa radiallahu ta'ala anha means that Hafsa radiallahu ta'ala anha, she is the daughter of Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu and Zainab bint Mad'un. Zainab bint Mad'un radiallahu anha. If you guys remember, yesterday we mentioned a name that I said is very important, Uthman ibn Mad'un. Can anyone remember who he was? It would be amazing if you could, without looking at your notes. The husband of who? The husband of Khawla bint Hakim, the matchmaker, right? So Zainab bint Mad'un is the older sister of Uthman ibn Mad'un radiallahu ta'ala anhu, and Zainab is the mother of Hafsa. She's also the mother of Abdullah ibn Umar. So Abdullah ibn Umar is a full brother to Hafsa. May Allah be pleased with them. And also Abdurrahman al-Akbar. Abdurrahman, the big Abdurrahman. Why? Umar radiallahu anhu, he married multiple women and he had two other Abdurrahmans. He had Abdurrahman al-Awsat and he had Abdurrahman al-Asghar. So he had the big Abdurrahman, the middle Abdurrahman, and he had the little Abdurrahman. Because he heard the Prophet ﷺ say that Ahabbul Asma' ila Allah, the most beloved of names to Allah, are Abdurrahman and Abdullah. So he named three kids Abdurrahman. So Umar radiallahu anhu, he married multiple women, but particularly here with Umar and Zainab bint Mad'un, you had Hafsa, Abdullah, and Abdurrahman, the oldest Abdurrahman. And in that, by the way, is a very, very important point that I'm going to make here. And some of you might have heard me go off on this before. There is absolutely nothing to suggest that Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu ever buried his daughters alive, even in Jahiliyyah. That is a completely baseless narration. In fact, Hafsa radiallahu anha was born 5 years before the Bi'tha. So 5 years before the Prophet ﷺ received revelation, which would mean how long? What was the year? Come on guys. This is going to go till 10 o'clock. 605, all right? 610 was the Bi'tha, so she was born in the year 605. So he didn't bury her. And Umar radiallahu anhu, as also narrated by Abdullah, he had a daughter by the name of Asiyah. And the Prophet ﷺ changed her name to Jamila. Her name was the disobedient one, and the Prophet ﷺ changed her name to the beautiful one. Okay? So if he had two daughters, and there's also a third daughter that's spoken about, then how could Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu have been burying his daughters alive in Jahiliyyah? So there's absolutely no proof of it. It's a baseless incident. In fact, it's from people that don't like Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu that it was fabricated. Even if it was true, it wouldn't matter because whatever came before Islam is done away with. But that's just a point to make from a historical perspective. It is an absolute fallacy. There is nothing in our books of Sunan that suggests that Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu buried any of his daughters alive. All right? So Hafsa radiallahu anhu, we said she was born in the year 605. She became Muslim in the Meccan period as well. So she became Muslim early on in Mecca. And she made hijrah to Medina as well with her first husband. So the first husband of Hafsa radiallahu ta'ala anha, his name is Khunais ibn Hudhafa. Khunais ibn Hudhafa. And Khunais ibn Hudhafa, he's also Abu Hudhafa. So that's his kunya, though he doesn't have a son. You know, a lot of times you'll call the child the father of, or the mother of the father or the parent, just to, hoping that they'll grow up, I guess, to call their kids that. You know, so he was called Abu Hudhafa, even though he never lived to have any children. And his name was Khunais ibn Hudhafa. Khunais became Muslim very, very, very early on in Mecca. He's one of the earliest Muslims. He became Muslim before Dar al-Arqam was established, which is very early on in Mecca. So he became Muslim even before Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu ta'ala anhu. And he's from Ashab al-Hijratain, just like Sauda. He's from the people that made hijrah to both Abyssinia and to Medina. But he married Hafsa, it seems, when he came back from the first hijrah, or he left Hafsa behind. So he's from the earliest Muslims, and he was also, he was married to Hafsa, and this is significant as well. Hafsa radiallahu anha was 10 years old when she married him, which again goes back to the age that people used to get married back in those days. She was 10 years old when she married Khunais ibn Hudhafa. Now, when they made hijrah, everyone was paired off, right, with one of the Ansar. His brother from the Ansar was Abdurrahman ibn Jabr. Abdurrahman ibn Jabr was the one that received Hafsa and her husband, Khunais ibn Hudhafa. Now, Khunais radiallahu ta'ala anhu, being from the Sabiqun, being from the early Muslims, it's clear that Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu loved him because of that reason. He was, a very good young man who believed in the Prophet ﷺ early, and who was also described as having the traits of bravery. Like, if you're not brave, don't ask to marry a daughter of Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu. You got to be a strong man to marry a daughter of Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu. So he's a man of shuja', he's a man of great bravery, a man of great strength, a man of great courage. He fought in the battle of Badr, and he fought also in the battle of Uhud. And he suffered a wound in Uhud that he died from later on. All right? And when he passed away, his funeral was led by the Messenger ﷺ. Rasulullah ﷺ prayed janazah on him, and he was buried in the Baqi'. Now this is for you, those of you that are really paying attention and really trying to connect names. He was buried in the Baqi' next to Uthman ibn Mad'un. And remember, Uthman ibn Mad'un, how does he relate to Hafsa? Please, somebody tell me, please. So he would be the maternal uncle of Hafsa. Uthman ibn Mad'un was the very first man that was buried in Al-Baqi', in the cemetery next to the masjid in Medina. He was the very first man that was buried there. And so Hafsa radiallahu anha's uncle was the first man buried there, and then her husband passed away, and he was buried right next to him. All right, which shows you the early death of her husband. And Hafsa radiallahu ta'ala anha, she was a very, very young woman at this time. She was only 21 years old. She already lost her husband. And as soon as her iddah finished, as soon as her waiting period finished, Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu ta'ala anhu started to look for a husband for her. Now, when Hafsa radiallahu ta'ala anha, when this happened, and her husband passed away, she didn't have any children, and she was described obviously as, in any way, as being very sad and things of that sort. And not, and she asks Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, obviously to find only the best of people, meaning I don't want to marry someone that's not going to match, my first husband. So Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he went first to Uthman ibn Affan radiallahu ta'ala anhu, as soon as her iddah finished, as soon as her waiting period was over. Now Uthman radiallahu anhu, he just lost Ruqayya in the battle of Badr as well. Ruqayya radiallahu ta'ala anha passed away, the daughter of the Prophet ﷺ. So he went to Ruqayya. And when he went to Ruqayya, when he went to Uthman, he said, what do you think about my daughter? what is your opinion about Hafsa? And obviously when he says that, he's hinting to Uthman that, what do you think about marrying her? So Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he said, let me think about it. All right? Now, Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he comes back to Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu the next day, and Uthman is in salah. He's in prayer. And Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he increased his prayer so that he wouldn't have to talk to Umar. So can you imagine how offensive that would be? Like he walks into that to where Uthman is, he sits behind Uthman, and Uthman's taking his sweet time in ruku' and in sujood until Umar leaves. He won't exit his salah until Umar radiallahu anhu leaves. And then he comes, after a few days later, he says that, I'm not really interested in getting married right now. So he gives Umar radiallahu anhu the answer that I'm not interested in getting married. So then Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu went to Abu Bakr. Now, you might think to yourself, why go to Uthman before Abu Bakr? Why not go to Abu Bakr first? Right? Who's better, Abu Bakr or Uthman? Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, but Uthman is single. So, even though Abu Bakr is better, Hafsa would be a second wife or possibly even a third wife at this point in Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu's life. It's better to go to Uthman radiallahu anhu. He's still single. He's wealthy. He's well off. He's a man of great virtue. He's a man who's very handsome. Uthman radiallahu anhu is a great character, right? And just someone that would, anyone would be fortunate. I mean, the Prophet ﷺ married 2 of his daughters to him, right? So Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he's pretty offended by that, but he goes to Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu. Abu Bakr radiallahu ta'ala anhu says, let me think about it. And one narration, Abu Bakr said, meet me in this place and inshallah I'll let you know. Umar shows up and Abu Bakr is not there. And Abu Bakr is clearly dodging him and doesn't want to give him an answer. So Umar radiallahu anhu said, Abu Bakr even offended me more. Because at least Uthman eventually told me I'm not interested. Abu Bakr just went MIA, right? He just disappeared. And he clearly didn't want to see me and even try to and even give me that answer. So Umar is thinking that, what's wrong with my daughter here? So he went to the Prophet ﷺ to complain to the Prophet ﷺ about how, Abu Bakr and Uthman treated him. And Rasulullah ﷺ said that your daughter will marry someone better than Uthman, and Uthman will marry someone better than your daughter. Your daughter will marry someone better than Uthman, and Uthman will marry someone better than your daughter. The Prophet ﷺ meant by that, of course, he was proposing to Hafsa, that he would marry Hafsa radiallahu anha, and that Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu was going to marry the second daughter of the Prophet ﷺ, Kulthum, okay, after Ruqayyah had passed away. So Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu obviously was ecstatic. I mean, this is much better than what he would have thought. I mean, he prefers the Prophet ﷺ, of course, to both Abu Bakr and Umar. But he's still upset with Abu Bakr and Uthman, right? So Abu Bakr radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he notices he's upset and he comes back to him and he says to him, hey, are you still mad at me? Were you upset with me for that time? And he said, of course I was. And Abu Bakr radiallahu ta'ala anhu and Uthman radiallahu anhu, they say, wallahi, nothing stopped us from marrying Hafsa, meaning we both would have accepted the proposal had we not heard the Prophet ﷺ mention her. Meaning the Prophet ﷺ had confided in Abu Bakr and Uthman in a way, or he said something about Hafsa that indicated to them that the Prophet ﷺ was interested in marrying her. And the scholars say that Rasulullah ﷺ wanted to solidify his companionship with these people. So with Abu Bakr, he's married to his daughter. With Umar radiallahu anhu, he marries his daughter. With Uthman, he marries Uthman to 2 of his daughters. And then with Ali, he marries to his most beloved daughter, to Fatima. So that way he establishes those close ties with all 4 of these men. He has a family relationship with all of them. So after that, the Prophet ﷺ, he married Hafsa radiallahu anha, and this took place in the 3rd year after Hijrah now. The 3rd year after Hijrah, with a mahar of 400 dirhams. Hafsa radiallahu ta'ala anha, she was 21 years old when she married the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now here's the really cool thing. If you look at the picture, I want you to see where the hujrah of Hafsa radiallahu ta'ala anha is. If you notice, that one next to the masjid is Aisha. All right, the one that's directly connected to the masjid. Hafsa radiallahu anha, her chamber was there, her apartment was there, basically behind the masjid. You know what's amazing about that? When you stand now to give salam to the Prophet ﷺ, Abu Bakr and Umar, you're standing in Hafsa's house. You're standing in what was Hafsa's house, because Aisha's house is now where the graves are. And obviously the masjid expanded, and you walk out and you are in Hafsa's house when you say salam to the Messenger ﷺ and to Abu Bakr and to Umar. So Hafsa radiallahu anha, her apartment was there. And, her personality, she has the romance with the Prophet ﷺ, so she says that Rasulullah ﷺ used to kiss me even when he was fasting. So she mentioned some of those fiqhi points. But her personality, Aisha radiallahu anha described it. She says, "Kanat bint abiha." She was the daughter of her father, meaning she had a temper. She was very, very, she was just like Umar radiallahu ta'ala anha. So Aisha says she had a very strong personality. And Aisha actually says that we got along. We kind of, we were sort of like the companions because she was pretty young. She wasn't as young as Aisha, obviously, but she was pretty young. And Aisha also had a very strong personality. So she said that they actually got along pretty well. And we find that, again, they were kind of in that camp together. They were on a side together most of the time. They had their issues as well sometimes. But most of the time, they were together. So there were moments that they competed over the Prophet ﷺ. There's a hadith that's narrated in Bukhari that one time when the Prophet ﷺ drew lots, the lots came for both me and Hafsa. So Rasulullah ﷺ took both me and Hafsa on a journey. And at night, as we were walking, the Prophet ﷺ, he would come and he would stand next to my camel and he would talk to me. So Aisha radiallahu anha, she says that Hafsa came to me and Hafsa said, "How about we switch camels for a night so that I can experience that and you can experience what it's like for me to see that and whatever it may be." So they switched camels. The Prophet ﷺ, he went to the camel of Hafsa, meaning it was out front. So the Prophet ﷺ went and he stood next to the camel of Hafsa and he walked with her and he talked to her the entire night. And Aisha radiallahu anha, she said that I was making dua to Allah to send a scorpion to bite me so that I would fall into unconsciousness so that I wouldn't do anything that was going to hurt the Prophet ﷺ. Because she said I was so jealous riding the camel behind the Prophet ﷺ and Hafsa and watching her talk to him the entire time. So Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha said, I asked Allah, send me a scorpion to bite me so I can just not feel this, so I don't have to blame the Prophet ﷺ and I don't blow up on them. And we also find, and this is Ramadan coming up, so in Ramadan, Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, she asked the Prophet ﷺ's permission to perform i'tikaf as well, in the last 10 nights. So the Prophet ﷺ, he gave her that permission, okay? So Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, she went ahead and she pitched her tent and she also did i'tikaf. Then Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, she says that Hafsa radiallahu anha came, and Hafsa radiallahu ta'ala anha, she asked permission, right? وَسَأْلَتْ Hafsa Aisha. She didn't ask the Prophet ﷺ, she asked Aisha. I mean, they're still buddies, like, I'm going to ask your permission. أَن تَسْتَأْذِن لَهَا, for Aisha to give her permission to pitch a tent as well. So Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha gave her that permission, فَفَعَلَتْ. So she did that as well. Hafsa pitched the tent, and Aisha pitched the tent. When Zainab radiallahu anha heard, Zainab went and she pitched the tent. And when the Prophet ﷺ saw that, Rasulullah ﷺ said that is their intention righteousness, or is this some sort of, is this competition? Meaning they're not doing this for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the Prophet ﷺ, he left i'tikaf that Ramadan. He didn't do i'tikaf that Ramadan. And so he left them there. This is basically a test you, meaning if you're trying to compete over the Prophet ﷺ, you're not getting him. You still have to do your i'tikaf though, right? In the masjid, and the Prophet ﷺ, he didn't do i'tikaf that year. And so the next year, the Prophet ﷺ added 10 nights. He did an extra 10 nights of i'tikaf, right? So this shows you again the overall competition between Aisha, Hafsa, Zainab. But again, Aisha and Hafsa were still sort of in the same boat. And so that's why we find the very famous incident obviously here, which is what's narrated in Surah At-Tahrim, or the Surah At-Tahrim is basically about this incident. All right, Surah At-Tahrim is basically about this incident. This is the narration of Ubayd ibn Umar, and there are various narrations with small technical differences between some of these narrations, but they still give us an overall picture. This one is in Bukhari from Ubayd ibn Umar radiyallahu ta'ala anhuma. He says that Aisha radiyallahu anha said that one time the Prophet ﷺ spent extra time at Zainab's house, and he drank some of the honey at her house. So Hafsa and I, we decided that if the Prophet ﷺ comes to either one of us, we would act like the Prophet ﷺ's breath smelled bad from the honey of Zainab. Okay? So Hafsa and Aisha sort of agreed that when he comes, tell the Prophet ﷺ that his breath smells like maghafir. Maghafir is like it's a desert plant, and it smells really, really foul. Okay? So when he went to Aisha's house, Aisha radiallahu anha said, she showed some aversion. The Prophet ﷺ said, what is it? And Aisha radiallahu anha said that your breath smells like maghafir. So the Prophet ﷺ then went to Hafsa radiallahu anha, and Hafsa said the same thing. So the Prophet ﷺ, he said that I'm never going to eat this honey again. Rasulullah ﷺ harrama, he forbade it for himself. It's not tashri' here, it wasn't legislation, but it was just himself. Like, I've made this haram for me, I'm not going to eat this honey anymore. Because the Prophet ﷺ, as Aisha radiallahu anha says, the Prophet ﷺ cared for his breath. Like, he used to use his siwak all the time. The Prophet ﷺ liked to have good breath. So he hated that his breath would smell bad. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed after that, Ya ayyuhan nabi, which is in Surah At-Tahrim, lima tuharrima ahalallahu lak, why are you making forbidden that which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala permitted to you? And in Surah At-Tahrim, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also invites Aisha and Hafsa to make tawbah to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to repent to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why? Because they disclosed some secret amongst themselves. And the secret amongst themselves, as Aisha radiallahu anha says in this particular narration, that about the honey, that they mentioned that secret to one another, and they sort of plotted against the Prophet ﷺ in regards to that. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He revealed that in regards to Aisha and Hafsa. And Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu gives us some more context now, and it ties it into an even greater incident that involves Hafsa. Ibn Abbas radiallahu ta'ala anhu said that for an entire year I wanted to ask Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu about those verses, but I was too shy. So he said, finally, one day we were together, and we were picking some of the siwaks from the arak tree, and Ibn Abbas radiallahu ta'ala anhu said, I asked him who were the two women, and he said, Umar radiallahu anhu cut me off as if he was frustrated and said, Aisha and Hafsa. It was them, meaning my daughter and Aisha. Then Umar radiallahu anhu starts to give this long narration. And Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he says that he starts to tell Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu everything. He says, and this is really beautiful. I wish I could read in Arabic. I'll give you guys a narration, inshallah, because of the time. It's in Bukhari. Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu says that in the days of Jahiliyyah, we never used to show any regard to women. Like, we didn't show regard or respect to women in the days of Jahiliyyah. But then Islam came, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala assigned certain rights to them. And he said, so we used to give them their rights in Mecca, but we didn't used to let them interfere in our affairs. Like, they still knew their place, and and he's saying they still knew their place. They didn't get involved in our business. He said, then we came to Medina, and everything changed. The women of Mecca met the women of Medina. Things changed. So he said, one day, me and my wife got into an argument. Me and my wife were fighting, and we got into an argument. And as she raised her voice at me, I responded to her. I said, SubhanAllah, you didn't used to respond this way. It's strange that you're responding to me with such audacity, right? And she said to Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, what? Your daughter responds to the Prophet ﷺ that way. And Umar radiallahu anhu said, what? My daughter talks to the Prophet ﷺ that way? So Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu says that I went straight to the house of Hafsa radiallahu anha, and he heard Hafsa, subhanAllah, at that moment he heard Hafsa raising her voice on the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So he said that I didn't sleep that night. I came to Hafsa radiallahu ta'ala anha, and I said, are you raising your voice with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Are you arguing with him? She said, yeah, we do it all the time. And he said, don't think you're like Aisha. He said, you are not to the Prophet ﷺ what Aisha is, nor is your father what Abu Bakr is. So you're not at the position of Aisha, nor am I at the position of Abu Bakr. Don't argue with him like you're Aisha or something like that. Calm down, don't argue with him. So Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, after that, he went and he even complained to Salama radiallahu ta'ala anha. And Salama radiallahu ta'ala anha said that, it's amazing that you're intervening in the affairs of the Messenger ﷺ so much that you're trying to monitor the arguments between him and his wives. Like Salama told Umar radiallahu anhu, back off. This isn't your business. This is how we talk with the Prophet ﷺ at times. It is what it is. We're husband and wife too, so sometimes we're going to argue. So Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he was just, what can I do? So Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu said, I had a neighbor from Bani Umayyah ibn Zayd, and he said in the area, I forgot what, subhanAllah, it just escapes me. I say this a million times. But Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu said that we had in an area I had this neighbor, and he said that we used to take turns with the Prophet ﷺ. If I had to take a day off, then he would go and accompany the Messenger ﷺ. And sometimes I would accompany the Messenger, and then we'd meet and we'd talk about what we missed. So he said, I missed out on some time with the Prophet ﷺ, and he said, after that I came back, and he said that at that time, there were nearby lands that were surrendering to the Prophet ﷺ. He said, except for the king of Ghassan in Asham, the king of Ghassan in Asham, that he was actually threatening an attack on the Prophet ﷺ. So he said, I came back after some time, and there was a lot of talk going amongst the Ansar, and people were talking. So I said, what happened? I started to ask, and I asked my neighbor, what happened? Did Al-Ghassani come? Did the king Ghassan come? And he said, greater than that, ya Amir al-Mu'mineen. Or not, greater than that, O Umar. He said, it's even worse than that. He said, what is it? He said, Rasulullah ﷺ has divorced his wives. So Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu said, oh my God. He goes straight to the house of Hafsa radiallahu anha, and he sees her weeping and crying. And he says, didn't I tell you not to argue with the Prophet ﷺ? Didn't I tell you not to speak to the Prophet ﷺ that way? And he sees, the women of the Prophet, he sees the wives of the Prophet ﷺ, they're crying as well. And he asks, where is the Prophet ﷺ? And Rasulullah ﷺ had taken a time away. He secluded himself from his wives for some time. So Bilal radiallahu ta'ala anhu was watching the Prophet ﷺ. Bilal radiallahu anhu was basically guarding the door of the Prophet ﷺ. No one was bothering him. Rasulullah ﷺ was in khalwa. He was in seclusion. And Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he sought permission. And the Prophet ﷺ, he allowed him to come in. So Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he came in, and Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he says that I said to Rasulullah ﷺ, Ya Rasulullah, we Quraysh, we used to have the upper hand over our women until we came here. And these people, their women have the upper hand over them. And now our women act the same way. So he says, Rasulullah ﷺ, he smiled. So that was the first smile from the Prophet ﷺ. He said, Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu said, and I went to Hafsa radiallahu anha, I went to Hafsa and I warned her, don't argue with the Prophet ﷺ. You're not at the state of Aisha, nor is your father at the station of Abu Bakr. So he said he smiled again. So Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu said that when he smiled again, I went closer to him, like I went to sit next to him after that. Like, now I'm breaking the ice with the Prophet ﷺ. And he said, but subhanAllah, I looked around and I saw on the back of the Prophet ﷺ the marks from his bed. And I saw that there was nothing in this room. And I remembered, subhanAllah, it's like he forgot what he was coming to complain to the Prophet ﷺ about. He started to cry. And now the Prophet ﷺ asked Umar, why are you crying? And he said, Ya Rasulullah, I've seen the palaces of Caesar and I've seen the palaces of Kisra, and you are so much more deserving of that. SubhanAllah, look, you're living in this poverty. And the Prophet ﷺ says, Afi shakkin anta ibn al-Khattab, are you in doubt, O Ibn al-Khattab? Right? Aren't you pleased that to them they have the dunya and to us belongs the hereafter, to us belongs the akhirah? So the context of that incident is actually this, that Umar radiallahu anhu, when he saw the marks on the back of the Prophet ﷺ, he forgot why he was upset, and he told the Prophet ﷺ, about that. And then finally, he says that after that, we got back to the conversation, and he said that I asked the Prophet ﷺ, have you divorced all of your wives? And the Prophet ﷺ, he gave a look that basically showed no. So Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu was relieved that he did not divorce all of his wives. However, it is, and I will say this because it's very, very, very important. In Sunan Abi Dawud, it's authentic that the Prophet ﷺ طَلَّقَهَا. He actually divorced Hafsa radiallahu ta'ala anha with a revocable divorce. And he took her back. Now, what's very important here, by the way, to understand, and why I say this, okay, had hitting a woman, had darib in the sense that we understand it in our linguistics of actually beating a woman, been part of the sharia before divorce, then wouldn't the Prophet ﷺ have hit Hafsa? Right? But Aisha radiallahu anha testifies that the Prophet ﷺ never hit a woman, not his wives, nor a female servant. And there is no narration of him ever physically abusing Hafsa. In fact, ever becoming verbally abusive with Hafsa radiallahu ta'ala anha. Instead, we see that the Prophet ﷺ maintained a very calm demeanor. Okay? Now, the reason for this, again, that Aisha radiallahu anha, Hafsa radiallahu ta'ala anha, they were, it's connected to the incident of Surah Al-Tahrim. All right? It's connected to them divulging the secret, but just in general, Hafsa radiallahu ta'ala anha used to argue with the Prophet ﷺ a lot. However, the Prophet ﷺ, he did take her back, and Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu was very relieved by that. And we see that the Prophet ﷺ, again, it's very interesting because when he takes her back. You know, I wasn't playing when I said when I taught the story of Jibreel, I had like 2 hours more of material that I couldn't teach there. Jibreel alayhi salam plays a role here too as well. Jibreel came to the Prophet ﷺ, and Jibreel interceded on behalf of Hafsa. Jibreel said, "Raji'ha, take her back, فَإِنَّهَا صَوَّامَ قَوَّامَ." Take her back, Ya Rasulullah, because she's a woman that always fasts, not that fasts sometimes, that always fasts, always prays Qiyamul Layl, وَإِنَّهَا زَوْجَتُكَ فِي الْجَنَّةِ, and she's going to be a wife of yours in Jannah. So you should take her back, Ya Rasulullah. I mean, what's a greater testimony of your character than that? Jibreel alayhi salam coming and saying, I know this woman, she fasts, she prays Qiyamul Layl, she's going to be your wife in Jannah, take her back. So the Prophet ﷺ took her back on the basis of that order from Jibreel alayhi salam, that she is a righteous woman that fasts and that prays much. So that's to her virtue, radiyallahu ta'ala anha. Some of the other things, by the way, in regards to her virtue, she is a hafidh of Quran like Aisha. So she memorized the Quran, and she was one of the few women and the few people actually of that time that could read and write. So she was literate, she could read and write. She was called Harisatul Quran, the guardian of the Quran. Why was she called the guardian of Quran? Because she plays a very, very important role in Islamic history. When Abu Bakr radiallahu ta'ala anhu ordered the Mus'haf to be put together, the Mus'haf stayed with him. When Abu Bakr passed away, it went to Omar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu ta'ala anhu. When Omar passed away, it went to Hafsa. Okay? So Hafsa radiallahu anha was the guardian of that only Mus'haf that was collected at that point in its full collection. And when Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu brought it all together, Uthman called for that Mus'haf back, and Uthman radiallahu anhu made the rest of the copies on the basis of that Mus'haf. So she was the one that actually guarded the Quran, and so that's one of the great things about her life, radiallahu ta'ala anha. She was someone that also witnessed, the Khilaf of Abu Bakr, witnessed the Khilaf of Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu. And when it comes to the Khilaf of Umar, she was actually very close to her father. So you see that argument between her and her father, but remember her father, is also the one that was going and talking to Abu Bakr and Uthman, and we see a very, very close relationship between her and Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu ta'ala anhu. So we see conversations. One of the conversations that she said to Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu one time when she heard him make dua, Allahumma inni as'aluka al-mawtu fi sabilik fi baladi nabiyyik. Oh Allah, I ask you to die a shaheed in the city of your Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Hafsa radiallahu anha said, come on dad, no one's going to die shaheed in Medina. People don't die. You got to go out and battle somewhere, maybe in Asham. How are you going to die shaheed in Medina? And of course, Umar radiallahu anhu would die shaheed in the masjid of the Prophet ﷺ and would be buried. He's the third of the 3 moons, isn't he, in the house of Aisha. So Hafsa was the one who narrated that conversation. She also, when Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, became Khalifa, and Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu used to dress in a certain way, she said to him, why don't you dress nicer? Ya Abati, my dear father, why don't you dress nicer now that you're the Khalifa? And Umar radiallahu anhu said, don't you remember how your husband used to dress? And they both started to cry. And they both started to console one another over the loss of the Prophet ﷺ. So they loved each other, they loved the Prophet ﷺ together, and they were consoling each other over the death of the Prophet ﷺ. And we even see actually when Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu passed away, and this is a hadith that's narrated in a sahih from Anas radiallahu ta'ala anhu, that when Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu was dying, when he was wounded, Hafsa was crying very, very, very loudly. I mean, she was in a lot of pain watching her father. And of course, Umar's death is a very gruesome death, right? He was stabbed multiple times. The blood is coming from his stomach. I mean, he was wounded severely. So you can imagine, to see your father in that state is not easy. And Hafsa radiallahu ta'ala anha was really, in her loudest voice, crying over Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu. And Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he asked her to calm down, because he said, don't you know that niyaha, that wailing hurts the dead? Makes it harder on the deceased. So he actually had to calm Hafsa radiallahu ta'ala anha down as he was passing away, radiallahu ta'ala anhu. And so she witnessed the death of her father. And she used to take care of some of the orphans in her house as well. She took care of the daughter of Zayd ibn al-Khattab, who was the uncle, who was the brother of Umar ibn al-Khattab. So she took care of her daughter as long as she lived. When the daughter of Zayd passed away, after Hafsa passed away, Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhu took that house. So he took actually the house of Hafsa radiallahu ta'ala anha. Okay? And she did play some role in politics, but a very minor role in politics. Why? Because she wanted to go out with Aisha, but Abdullah ibn Umar stopped her. Abdullah ibn Umar said, don't involve yourself in this. And that was the position of Ibn Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, of course. So he prevented her from getting involved in the politics of her time, in the fitan, and he saved her from that. So she maintained a relatively neutral stance through all of the politics that she saw. And she died in the time of Muawiyah, radiallahu ta'ala anhu, which is 41 years after Hijrah. And she was 60 years old, radiallahu ta'ala anha, and she was also buried in al-Baqi'. Okay, so that's Hafsa, radiallahu ta'ala anha. The next one, and the one that we're going to cover tonight, because it's a very quick one, and she is the wife of the Prophet ﷺ that we know the absolute least about, and she is Zainab bint Khuzaimah. Zainab bint Khuzaimah. The Prophet ﷺ had two wives named Zainab. Okay, so he had Zainab bint Khuzaimah, and then the prominent wife that we'll talk about in detail is Zainab bint Jahsh, radiallahu anha. So Zainab bint Khuzaimah married the Prophet ﷺ right after Hafsa. So she comes in right after Hafsa. Who is she? Now Zainab radiallahu ta'ala anha. Now by the way, the name Zainab, just because we're going to do this inshallah ta'ala, just to understand the linguistic meaning of the name as well. The name Zainab, it refers to a beautiful flower, like a fragrant flower. But it also means zinatul ab. So the precious daughter, okay, so the one that decorates, that beautifies her father, that obeys her father, that the precious jewel of her father. So someone that's really beloved to her father. Okay, so zinatul ab. So that's what Zainab means. She's not from Quraysh. She's from a Najdi tribe. She's from a tribe from a Najd named Banu Hilal. Okay, Banu Hilal. And a Najd is very far away from Mecca, by the way. A Najd is very far away. How does she get into Mecca? She was married to the cousin of the Prophet ﷺ, and in fact she was married 3 times before the Prophet ﷺ, or at least 2 times, maybe a 3rd time. Her first husband was named Tufayl ibn al-Harith ibn Abd al-Muttalib. Tufayl ibn al-Harith ibn Abd al-Muttalib. Okay? He divorced her, and then she was married to his brother, who's also the cousin of the Prophet ﷺ, Ubaidah ibn al-Harith, radiyallahu ta'ala anhu. Ubaidah ibn al-Harith was the 12th person to accept Islam. So extremely early, the 12th person to accept Islam. He was in the Battle of Badr. He was one of the people that were fighting out front with Ali and Hamza. So they had al-Mubaraza in the front, where 3 people from each side, 3 of the finest warriors will fight on each side. He was the one on the side of Ali and Hamza, may Allah be pleased with them. And Ubaidah radiallahu ta'ala anhu, his leg was cut off in al-Mubaraza, it was severed in al-Mubaraza, and he died right after Badr. Okay, so he was a shaheed in Badr, and he was someone that was close to the Prophet ﷺ as well. Obviously, to be given that position, to fight alongside Hamza and Ali, may Allah be pleased with them, requires you to be a very special person. And there's a 3rd person that there are narrations that she was married to, which is Abdullah ibn Jahsh, who is the brother of who? Zainab bint Jahsh. Okay, so that she married Abdullah ibn Jahsh. And Abdullah ibn Jahsh was martyred in Uhud. So you talk about a difficult life, subhanAllah. She went through 3 husbands before the Prophet ﷺ. Her name, even before Islam, was al-Masakin, the mother of the poor. al-Masakin, the mother of the poor. She used to give a lot of charity, so she was known as that before Islam and Jahiliyyah. As Ibn Hajar rahimahullah says, it continued after as well, into Islam, that she was known as al-Masakin. She didn't have any children. The most interesting person in her family tree is her mother by far. Her mother is very, very, very interesting. Her mother is Hind bint Auf. I want you to remember this name, Hind bint Auf. Now, Hind bint Auf married many, many, many men, in the sense that she lost a lot of husbands and she got remarried again. And subhanAllah, she has some of the most fortunate children and grandchildren, or she is fortunate to have some of the greatest children and grandchildren that have ever walked the face of the earth. So let's look at who her half-sisters were and who her half-brothers were, because Zainab bint Khuzaimah, so Khuzaimah and her mother, we don't know of any siblings to Zainab that are full siblings. We know half-siblings, half-sisters and half-brothers. Some of her half-sisters, number 1, Maymuna bint al-Harith. Maymuna bint al-Harith, who's also a wife of the Prophet ﷺ. So Maymuna bint al-Harith would also be married to the Prophet ﷺ later on. So that's one of her half-sisters. Okay? and they're the same mother, not the same father as we said. Also, Salma bint Umays. Salma bint Umays, radiyallahu anha, who was the wife of Hamza, radiyallahu anhu. I'm going to draw this all for you guys and I'll send you guys a family tree, inshallah. How about that? All right. We'll make that available to all of the BTV members, all right? But still, try to follow me, okay? So there's Salma, who's married to Hamza. Did they have any children? Did Hamza radiallahu anhu have any children? Yes, he did actually. Hamza had a daughter named Umara bint Hamza. So that's their daughter. So this mother now is already the mother of two wives of the Prophet ﷺ, and the mother-in-law of Hamza, and the grandmother of the daughter of Hamza. Now, when Hamza passed away, Umara was going to be raised in another household. That household was the household of another daughter, Asma bint Umays, who we talked about yesterday. Asma bint Umays, who can tell me who she was? Related to Sauda? Maybe. Who was she married to? She married Ja'far ibn Abi Talib first. And Asma radiallahu ta'ala anha, Asma bint Umays, her and Ja'far, naturally, Hamza's child, Umara, came into their household. When Ja'far passed away, she married Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu ta'ala anhu and had Muhammad ibn Abi Bakr. When Abu Bakr passed away, she married Ali ibn Abi Talib. So Hind bint Auf now, you can just add that on to her children and grandchildren. She has lineage now through Abu Bakr radiallahu ta'ala anhu as well. They also have, she has a brother by the name of Aoun ibn Umays, and we don't know of any children for him. Also, Fadl, Lubaba bint al-Harith, Fadl radiyallahu anha. And who is she? She's the mother of Abdullah ibn Abbas, the wife of Al-Abbas. So she's also the mother-in-law of Al-Abbas radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, and the grandmother of Al-Fadl and Abdullah and Ubaidullah, the children of Al-Abbas. Okay? It doesn't stop there, we're still not done. Okay? She's also the mother of a woman, another girl by the name of Lubaba. So she had two Lubabas. And this is Lubaba bint al-Harith as well. So she was called Lubaba Sughra, the younger Lubaba. And she is the mother of Khalid ibn al-Walid radiallahu ta'ala anhu. That's all in this woman's tree. So pretty much half of the Sahaba, right? MashaAllah, tabarakallah, are all in her tree. So she's an interesting woman. The mother is very interesting, of Zainab bint Khuzaimah radiallahu ta'ala anha. So the Prophet ﷺ married her after she had been, she'd been married 3 times previously, 2 or 3 times previously. She was married in Ramadan in the 4th year after Hijrah to the Prophet ﷺ. Ramadan in the 4th year after Hijrah. She died literally 2 or 3 months after being married to the Prophet ﷺ. So we know very little about her. Okay, she's the only wife other than Khadija radiallahu anha to die while the Prophet ﷺ was alive. Okay, the only other wife that the Prophet ﷺ would bury just a couple of months after. Some of the scholars say that the Prophet ﷺ married her. There are 2 reasons that are given. One of them is to make peace with her tribe. Because the tribe had some tension between them and the Muslims. So one of them was to make peace with the tribe. The other one obviously was out of loyalty to Ubayd ibn al-Harith, to take care of his widow, and then Abdullah ibn Jahsh, that she was married to some of the Prophet ﷺ's most beloved companions. So it was a means of taking in a widow that had no children or anything like that. And so the Prophet ﷺ brought her in. But again, we have 0 narrations of any interactions between her and the Prophet ﷺ, except the Prophet ﷺ burying her and praying on her in Al-Baqi'. She's buried in Al-Baqi' as well, in Medina. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be pleased with her. What a fortunate woman, subhanAllah. She just comes in and she marries the Prophet ﷺ, and she will be raised on the Day of Judgment as one of the wives of the Prophet ﷺ. And I'll share with you all a very beautiful gem that I heard from one of my teachers, from Shaykh Rajih, hafidhahullah ta'ala. He said that, there's a hadith that the Prophet ﷺ said, Sadaqah expands your lifespan. Sadaqah expands your lifespan. And this was a charitable woman. And it could be that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala just expanded her life just enough, extended her lifespan just enough to be able to marry the Prophet ﷺ and die. So I thought that was a very beautiful gem. It's not from a book, it was just something that he shared with us. He said, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can extend a person's lifespan through sadaqah, imagine this woman. She was Ummul Masakin, she was the mother of the poor. So Allah gave her this favor before she passed away. So I just want to show you guys a picture and then we're done inshallah. So you can now get a picture of what was going on in Medina at this point now. So if you notice here now, there are 5 houses. Okay? In the front, in the very front, that's Hafsa. That's her apartment. Then you have, who can tell me what the next row is? Aisha and Sauda. Okay? Now the last row, and this is very beautiful. The house right behind Aisha radiallahu anha, who knows whose house that is? That's Fatima's house. The Prophet ﷺ built her an apartment right there. And Aisha radiallahu anha and Fatima, they had windows that faced each other. And so they used to talk to each other through their windows all the time. Okay, so Aisha and Fatima, their homes, and that's where Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu anhu moved in, obviously, with Fatima, and that's why Al-Hassan and Hussein and those, they're always around the Messenger ﷺ because they live literally, not even across the street, I don't know if you'd call that a street, across the house, right, from the Prophet ﷺ. And then that house, which is the last one there, that would be the house of Zainab bint Khuzaimah. However, Zainab died quickly, so the next wife of the Prophet ﷺ will move into there. Who is that? Does anyone know? Salama radiallahu anha, who we'll talk about tomorrow inshallah. We'll start off with tomorrow inshallah. So that's going to be the house of Salama radiallahu ta'ala anha after Zainab bint Khuzaimah. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be pleased with our mothers. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to join us with them and with the Prophet ﷺ in the highest level of Jannat al-Firdaus. Allahumma ameen.